Hello, my name is Clara Mavelia and I set up the Cultural Entrepreneurship Institute here in Berlin. Today we are at the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities and we will soon speak with Dr. Nathalie Weidenfeld. Schön, Sie zu sehen, Frau Dr. Weidenfeld.
Good to see you, Dr. Weidenfeld. Would you like to introduce yourself? Would I like to? Yes, I'm Nathalie Weidenfeld. I studied literature and American cultural history, which is the field where I wrote my PhD. It was on extraterrestrials, and I might come back to that later because it does relate to our topic today. I write works of literature and also non-fiction and books about film because for many years I taught film studies. But you're also active in the Friends and Sponsors of the MCE, that's the Munich Center for Ethics, at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Why is the work of the center so important? It's interdisciplinary. It's an interface where lots of disciplines come together: law, medicine, philosophy, theology. And it's about addressing ethical issues in medicine, in law, in all these fields, researching it, and also thinking about how ethics can be infused into society. So the Friends and Sponsors that I chair support this work because I think that all of us need ethics in every field of life. And what role does philosophy play in your life, in your everyday life, in my personal life? Well, I'm married to a philosopher, so from that point of view, philosophy is, if you like, right among us. Apart from my husband, my favorite philosopher is Epictetus. His Enchiridion, or Handbook, is a wonderful book. I keep it by my bedside. And I think that Stoicism has a great deal to offer us today. But what about the division of labour in your family? The division of labour, quite specifically. My husband works a great deal. I work too. You mean who does the washing up and the vacuum cleaning? Yes, the practical things. It's important for philosophers too. Yes, it is. Because my husband travels a great deal and I tend to look after the children more than he does. I do take on responsibility for those homekeeping duties, not for reasons of principle, because women have to do that, but simply because our circumstances are like that. I think there's a certain connection with concrete life issues. For someone like me who likes to reflect and is caught up in poetry, it roots you somehow. I tussled with those duties for quite a long time, but it does have this rooting effect and I recommend it to everyone. But you've also written about philosophy and children. Are children better philosophers, ultimately? Whether they're better philosophers, probably not. But what was interesting, we've always talked to the children about key philosophical issues: liberty, freedom of will, self-determination, perception, truth, really the big themes. And the interesting thing, and I'm talking about small children here, when they were 8, 9, 10, basically all those philosophical views are reflected in what the children say. You had the postmodernist, you had the realist, you had the subjectivist. Of course, in simple terms, but they were all formulated. Those philosophical positions were reflected. And that's quite astonishing. So curiosity is there. Yes, curiosity, and these are themes that are very close to people, these philosophical issues. What are human beings? What does it mean to be free? What can we know? Justice. These are all themes that inspire children too and motivate them like adults. So it's regrettable that in German schools they don't teach a lot more philosophy, including primary schools, not only at grammar schools, any kind of school. Because we can't get by without ethics. All the time we stumble across ethical issues. Certainly we do. And your latest book is called Digital Humanism? No, you tell us. Yes, it's Digital Humanism, Ethics for the New Era of Artificial Intelligence. And what inspired you to write that book? Well, it's a collective project with my husband, the philosopher Julian Nieder-Rumelin. He was approached by the publisher Piper about whether he'd like to write something on digitalization. And very quickly there was this idea born that I might like to enrich the book with examples from cinema or examples from our popular culture. Because these images that circulate in popular culture, in films, first of all, shape our perception of how we see digitalization and artificial intelligence, and they express our anxieties, our hopes, and so forth. So that's how the book came to be. It's a kind of interdisciplinary cooperative venture. And how did you divide the labor of the writing? It was quite simple because my husband, as a philosopher, dealt with the philosophical content, or co-determined it, took responsibility for it, and then I added to the various chapters an introduction with an example from a film, and I ended the chapter as well with some observations from cultural studies. And how do you write? Is it hard work for you or flow? I love writing. I prefer writing to doing other things. So I don't find it difficult. I like sitting at home in front of my computer, and yes, it is a bit of a flow. So, comes out as complete sentences, or do you need to polish a bit? I think as I'm writing, and then I like to polish afterwards, but first of all I have to get it all off my chest. I'm a very associative person, so that blank page or blank screen is for me like a huge meadow where first of all I can gamble a bit and the polishing happens afterwards. Okay, let's come on to artificial intelligence. Why are people talking about it so much now? Well, technological developments require us to, and those big proclamations from Silicon Valley, which very much insist that in the near future there'll be a transformation, a mission. These are pretty big slogans that we are bombarded with, and pretty big expectations too, and a lot of images. As I just said, from popular culture, from films, which are then taking root in our cultural subconscious, and which really do trigger many fears, to some extent hopes, but anxieties. What will it be like if the world really does become completely digitalized? What will happen to human beings? Who will we be? What role will be played by robots? These are questions which really are in the air at the moment, and which of course the media pick up. Yes, but usually these are euphoric expectations or else apocalyptic fears. Robots, artificial intelligence have the power to get to us as human beings, the myths, the depths of humanity. Yes, if you look at the robot figure, I was just talking about my PhD on extraterrestrials, and we're talking about the 70s when there was a lot of extraterrestrials around in films, in books, especially in America. And what interested me was this stereotypical division between the good extraterrestrial, spiritual, superior, and the evil, dangerous extraterrestrial who abducts human beings, takes away their dignity and liberty, and perhaps has a demonic touch. And if you look back into history, the history of Western culture, you can see that there is always an other, an opposite. In Greek days, it was the barbarians. During the Enlightenment, it was the savages, the Indians. In the US, it was the Red Indians. And in the 70s, it was the extraterrestrials. So you create this opposite, this other. You can project either very good characteristics or very bad ones onto them, and you bounce off that in your imagination. Ultimately, it's always about the question, who are we? What is our culture? What is important to us compared with them? And it's similar at the moment with robots. In many respects, they've taken on the functions of the extraterrestrials. A figure is imagined, projected into the future, which is either incredibly good, the perfect father from Terminator 2, the perfect lover, the perfect friend, or the demonic evil robot like Hal in Space Odyssey. And then you kind of bounce off that to redefine who we are and what we are doing, what is our culture, what's important to us. And that as human beings we have both within us, good and evil. We tend to forget that. Carl Gustav Jung, the psychoanalyst, said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That comes up in the debate about immigration, doesn't it? Things that appear other to us are also part of ourselves. Yes, these are projection mechanisms. But I think what's going on here, we have powerful idealizations, either profoundly demonic or wonderfully perfect as a lover, as a friend, or whatever. And I think we forget something, that people are not perfect, that we're vulnerable and mortal. We have these images of robots. Let's think about the transhumanist fantasies, which are also triggered by images we're familiar with from Hollywood, Robocop, Iron Man, this regressive phantom of invulnerability, absolute invulnerability, immortality. These are regressive phantoms that move our minds away from what we really are as people. We are not unambiguously good or evil, and we are certainly not immortal and certainly not invulnerable. But that's because, partly, robots in this iconography, in these films, often have anthropomorphic features, because industrial robots don't trigger those feelings. No, that's true. Industry is very aware, think of Uncanny Valley, that if a robot starts to adopt human features, something takes effect that Freud describes in connection with the story by E.T.A. Hoffmann, The Sandman, where a young student falls in love with a doll, and this lifeless doll, which can't even speak, only nods mechanically and projects or attributes her with a soul and with feelings. And Freud says, this is animism. This is a primitive, magical view of the universe. And in the literary genre of uncanny literature, this plays a big role. This uncanny feeling, is it alive or isn't it? That's something that can be triggered if a robot starts to look a bit like a person, but you're not quite sure, is it alive, isn't it? Industry knows this and refuses to go down this road. You describe, in your book, you talk about Sophia, that robot that I think it was in October 2017, they presented her in Saudi Arabia. where people were so enthusiastic they immediately gave her citizenship, which Saudi women don't have. Yes, and especially she walks around without a veil. The fact that she walks around without a veil, I think, demonstrates that ultimately this is a PR gag and she's not really taken seriously. There are interviews where interviewers talk to her, and I think this uncanny moment, you can tell pretty quickly that she's not a human being and that she doesn't really feel. They've taught her to make little jokes like, yes, I'm going to subjugate the world at some point, but it's just play. Nobody really believes that Sophia really has feelings or intentions. But in a lot of films, those emotions are processed in dystopias. Yes, we were just talking about Silicon Valley. I think there are two visions, the apocalyptic and the euphoric. And from Silicon Valley, we're quite clearly getting the euphoric version. If we look at the iconography, the slogans that they work with there, this is salvation that's being offered. It's not about earning money, it's about making humanity better. Saving the world? Yes, saving the world. Okay, in the modern era, there's nothing new about that. If you look at the period when there were big technological innovations in the 19th century, new chemistry, electricity, Henry Ford and the car, the automobile. If you look at the kind of things that were said, Henry Ford writes about the car as the new Messiah, quote, that will bring us perpetual peace among the peoples. And heaven, he actually uses the word heaven. And this is a mindset, this salvation dimension. It's not new, but we are seeing it with digitalization again. That's one thing. And on the other side, there is the apocalyptic fear. Moravec, Kurzweil, or Stephen Hawking, who warns us against robots. So among scientists, there are a few scientists anyway, but also Hollywood, which is mostly about dystopias, digitalization as a dystopia. And between those two extremes, that's where we are operating. And it seems as though that is a big antithesis, but actually there are some common factors here, and that is passivity. In one case, we say technology will redeem us, and in the other case, we say technology will damn us. So in both cases, human beings play a back foot role and say technology is going to decide, not us. Hence digital humanism. This is where digital humanism comes in and says, no, it's not the technology that is constantly deciding how we're going to live and what is important, but it's us. We decide what technologies we want to have and what we want to use them for. Exactly. And in addition to that, perhaps we shouldn't give in to convenience, which technology does offer us, and make a little bit of an effort, inform ourselves about how these things work, what is fake news, and what is correct information, and so forth. But a lot of people like an easy life and simply hand over their data, which is dangerous. Yes, I think that is the big challenge for our children too, who grow up with this, with cookies and simply giving away your data. And I think as children get a bit older, they do start increasingly to develop an awareness of what's happening. And I think in the younger generation, increasingly we're seeing an aversion and increasingly a will to take control of their own data and their lives. Again, on Hollywood or also literature. I thought it was very interesting that you talked about electricity just now, because we know that this first character like this was Frankenstein, actually a literary figure. And then we had Metropolis in film with Fritz Lang, and recently Ava in Ex Machina. What's the connection between these three characters? Well, we could go on even further. This desire to breathe life into something without life begins with Pygmalion, the myth that Ovid described, in which an artist falls in love with his statue and wishes to bring it to life, which Venus then makes possible. And then you get it in the Middle Ages with Golem, and then in the Romance period with E.T.A. Hoffmann we mentioned, or Villiers de l'Isle Adam, L'Ève Future. And if you're talking about Metropolis and Ava and that combination, it's usually a male genius, a man who creates a perfect woman. Seems to be a very male-dominated Pygmalion complex. So you create your own woman, yes? Yes, although there was a very early film, and you find the robots in film from very early times. In 1911, there was a short film called A Mechanical Husband, where a young woman who doesn't like the husband that's been chosen for her dreams up her own robot husband. So we do find the other version. If we're talking of mythical characters, you talk about selfies and narcissism. Yes, there's a lot of research, and psychologists are pretty much in agreement that we live in an age where narcissism plays an increasing role. And okay, what came first, the selfie or narcissism? We can certainly say that narcissistic tendencies are reinforced by this pose. Narcissism, what worries me a little is this thing about revealing every thought you have. What happens to our culture, which is important psychologically, our culture of privacy and keeping secrets? Psychologists say that it's incredibly important for children during the developmental phase to have secrets. They need a protected space where they can develop their own identity. This digitalization calls for and encourages an incredible amount of self-revelation and a loss of ambiguity. The digital world is entirely immanent, transparent, and unambiguous. And I think that's part of humanism too, being able to maintain ambiguity and secrecy, opacity. Yes, we know the internet giants at home don't allow their children to play with these things, so it's okay for us to be dumbed down, but they know. Yes, this is cynicism, unrivaled cynicism. Steve Jobs, who in the afternoon presents his fantastic new iPad, and we know that he won't let his children use it. Or the founders of Microsoft, all of them, they know exactly what they're doing. It is indeed parallel to drug dealers, the big drug dealers who take no drugs themselves, which puts all the more pressure on us in the spirit of humanism, because humanism is all about preserving our autonomy and our self-determination. It's up to us to take control. Yes, and Europe has been the first to move in that direction with data protection regulation. What else might be done? Yes, well, we can say it's much too late. They could have done it earlier on, but at least it's there now. There are even voices from America saying, hey, look, we need to do this too. Europe can indeed play a pioneering role here and should not stop going down this path tirelessly. Jaron Lanier, one of the first people to think about these things, has written a book now, 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now. at the beginning we thought for a humane society we're making a better world because we're connecting people, but they can't stop it, they can't control it, or they say that they don't control the data, but they do control the data, and they're selling the data onto others and manipulating elections, and that is incredibly dangerous. Yes, we can see that now in the elections in Brazil, in the US. It's taken on quite worrying proportions, and it's true. Young people now confront this challenge of thinking about these things and working out what is truth. That, too, is a humanist value, the right to truth, true communication. Am I communicating with a bot, or is this a real person? It has to be done transparently, because this undermines democracy. So what would you suggest to users? Users? Young users, but also parents. Take back control. We're talking about children, and we did draw a parallel just now to drug addicts. It's quite clear that there is such a thing as addiction to mobile phones, and adults are no exception there. Children are developing their brains. It's only when they're 21, 25 that their brains are fully developed. They need parental assistance here. And to say to a kid, get a grip of it, isn't enough. You have to help. So good advice, I suppose, would be that to agree on certain times, especially in the evening, because we know that these waves, if you've been looking at your mobile phone just before you go to sleep, it has a very negative effect on your sleep. Simply to lock away, all of you, lock away your mobile phones, the whole family, agree after 7 p.m. we won't use our mobiles. That's a pretty good practical piece of advice. And it's good for parents too, because very often it's the parents that are still playing with their smartphones, not the children. Must be frustrating for the children. Yes, psychologists say that in other fields too. Children learn above all from example, and the best advice for parents is let's all be a good example in this respect too. As for addiction, it's gaming too, isn't it? Because that's an increasing problem. They have this casual gaming now, these very short games which you only take a few seconds to play. They say only a few cents, but that's money too. And that's spreading. The perfidious thing about it is that they know exactly what they're triggering, and they think very carefully about whether they use games or WhatsApp or Snapchat, these snap streaks. The people who invent these things know how to manipulate users and what you need to add in there to release dopamine. These are very calculated mechanisms, and you need to be aware of it. I think in the long run, nobody likes to be manipulated. You need to be aware what's behind these things and what interests are defining them. Silicon Valley and Hollywood then are very close to one another. Yes, if you like, they are two sides of the same coin. Silicon Valley makes profit from fomenting euphoria. Hollywood makes money, profit from fomenting dystopian fears. And that's what they have in common. And what do you do at home with your children, may I ask? With our first daughter, I think we didn't really think about it in advance. And it was only later on that we concluded that it's quite good to set certain rules. With our second daughter, she reads an awful lot and doesn't show any indication of addiction, so from that point of view it's fairly easy. Our little one is 5, and we'll be very careful with him. I think with boys, possibly the addiction to gaming is stronger. So I'll have to be very careful that he doesn't drift away into computer worlds. So other parents, like I myself tried with my daughter, to set up rules like switching off the internet. Sometimes she went along with it, other times she would say, even if you forbid me, I'm going to do it anyway. Yes, it's really difficult. Children spend a lot of time out of the home. You can't always be controlling them. But if we look at our daughter, it's to do with the awareness. When they get to be 15, they do start to think about the world as a whole and start to ask questions about who's controlling this, why should I be doing this? And I think that this process of developing autonomy, which you get in teenage years, is useful with digitalization as well. They want to have a handle on this as well. They want to have a handle on their lives, and this is part of it. So digital skills are part of growing up. It's not enough to have a control over these things in schools. You need your own digital skills and to decide for yourself how much you're going to do and when you're going to do it. Yes, so where do you want to devote your energies in the future? What projects do you have? In my other life, I also write novels and short stories, which I publish. For example, with Edition F, that's a publisher. A lot of texts there about relationships written with humour. I want to carry on doing that, but also I want to carry on projects with my husband and a similar division of labour as before, perhaps on gender. We'll see. Before we finish, I wanted to ask you if you could perhaps read us an excerpt from your book, especially the chapter about moral dilemmas involving humans and robots, because you have literature and film in that chapter. At the US Robotics Command Center, Spooner, the psychologist Dr. Calvin, and the good robot Sonny are fighting an army of evil robots, all controlled by the radically utilitarian software system Vicky, with an eerie red glow inside their metal bodies. The androids doggedly home in on Spooner, Calvin, and Sonny. But while they can't compete in numbers, the good guys possess an effective weapon with which they can destroy Vicky and with it all the evil robots. A kind of syringe which, once it's inserted in the right place, will instantly knock out the system and all the nanobots. Just as Sonny is about to stick the syringe into the central processing unit, Calvin slips and falls. That's the psychologist. With all her might, she manages to cling onto a steel girder. The void below her is hundreds of meters deep. Sonny, the robot, must make a decision. Should he kill Vicky, the evil central computer, and save humanity? Or only save the life of Dr. Calvin, a single person? Sonny, the robot, is clearly overtaxed. Sophisticated his algorithms may be, but he can find no solution to this dilemma. He doesn't want to kill Dr. Calvin, but on the other hand, he does want to protect humanity from Vicky. For Spooner, the detective, it's obvious what to do. "Save Calvin," he shouts to Sonny. As we've seen, weighing up is a practice that algorithms cannot express. This is nowhere so clear as in situations where there is a moral dilemma. A moral dilemma is when there is no satisfactory resolution to a moral conflict. When a person has two or more obligations that they can't fulfill at the same time. And whichever way they decide, they will incur guilt. Then they have a moral dilemma. that person will regret not living up to some obligation, even though a second obligation was making it impossible to fulfill the first. In moral dilemmas, all these obligations persist. They do not go away just because of the conflict. Not every moral conflict equates to a genuine moral dilemma. In many cases, it is possible, by weighing up different moral grounds, to arrive at a clear recommendation. Weighing up conflicting moral grounds, such as a duty to help versus a promise, does not have to result in a genuine moral dilemma. I promised to take one of my daughters to the cinema this afternoon, but on the way, I get a call to say my other daughter is running a fever and someone needs to drive her to the doctor. I think about it briefly, weigh up, and decide that my duty to help my sick daughter takes precedence over my duty to keep my promise about the cinema. This is not a moral dilemma, only a conflict between two grounds for obligation that can clearly be resolved in favour of one of those grounds. One might say the ground for the obligation to keep my promise about taking one daughter to the cinema is annulled by the superior obligation to help my other daughter who is ill. The ground for the obligation does not persist, because this obligation can only be fulfilled by reneging on a superior obligation. In many cases, however, there doesn't appear to be any resolution for such a moral conflict. A genuine moral dilemma occurs when conflicting grounds for obligation persist, and regardless of what I do, I will, in some way, incur guilt. Ancient tragedies developed a particular mastery for translating dilemmas like this, which inevitably entail moral guilt, into fiction. One impressive, though macabre example closer to our own day is William Styron's novel Sophie's Choice, 1979. The book is about a Jewish woman called Sophie during the Second World War, who is deported to a concentration camp by the Germans. The sadistic camp overseer presents Sophie with a choice. She can keep one of her children, but the other one will be gassed, and she now has to decide which one she wants to keep. If she fails to choose, both will die. Sophie decides to keep her son. Whichever way Sophie decides, she will incur tremendous guilt, either because she has sacrificed one of her children for the sake of the other, or because she has not prevented the murder of one of her children who could otherwise still be alive. Sophie survives, but even years later she's been unable to forgive herself, and eventually she takes her own life. The British ethical philosopher Bernard Williams came up with a variation on this dilemma. During a trip to South America, a tourist called Jim is travelling through a small town. He sees 20 Indios chained up by a wall. In front of them are several men in uniform. Their leader, Pedro, tells Jim that the men are to be shot to set an example to others following anti-government protests. Pedro now offers Jim, as a guest in his country, the honour of shooting one of the Indios. If he does it, the others will be released. If he doesn't, then all 20 will die as planned. Jim can neither escape nor negotiate with Pedro. He has to make a decision. The Indios ask him to accept the offer. Whatever he does, he will be guilty, either because he has murdered another human being or because he is responsible for the death of 20 Indios. What is Jim to do? Williams is keen to emphasize the following. The mere fact that the tourist refuses to take part in this gruesome game does not mean that he can necessarily be accused of causing the deaths of 19 more people. The militia leader will always be the one who created the situation. Even so, one will not feel reassured by the idea that doing nothing rules out moral guilt. Utilitarian consequentialist ethics rejects the existence of genuine moral dilemma. The reason is obvious. If actions are judged according to the criterion of optimization, maximize the expected value of the benefit, there can be no conflict, but at best indifference. It may well be that two behavioral options hold out the same expected benefit, but otherwise there is always a best option, and that is the one to choose. For a person motivated by utilitarian reasoning, to remain functional and not starve to death like Buridan's ass, they need to select between one of these indifferent options or possibly throw a dice. Genuine moral dilemmas are characterized by the fact that we are not allowed to throw a dice in order to choose between conflicting obligations. The situation is too serious for that. One might say, therefore, that the decision is existential, insofar as it tells us something about that person's fundamental attitude. There is much to suggest that the existence of moral dilemmas should be interpreted as confirming the general impossibility of offsetting different options in our moral deliberations. Digital computers are defined as Turing machines, and they supply unambiguous results. For that reason alone, they cannot constitute models for practical reason. The bewilderment of robots when confronted with true moral dilemmas is a recurrent theme in films too. Not only is Sonny perplexed at the end of the film about who he should be saving, other artificial beings are likewise thwarted by such situations. But unlike Sophie in Styron's novel, we cannot expect robots to feel guilty for the rest of their lives and ultimately to commit suicide, because they cannot continue to exist with the feeling that they took the wrong action. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and your work.